The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus said to his disciples, "Be sure of this, if the master of the house had known the hour when the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be prepared. For at an hour you do not expect, the Son of Man will come." Then Peter said, "Lord, is this parable meant for us or for everyone?" The Lord replied, "Who then is the faithful and prudent steward whom the master will put in charge of his servants to distribute the food allowance at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master on arrival finds doing so. Truly I say to you, he will put him in charge of all his property. But if that servant says to himself, 'My master is delayed in coming,' and begins to beat the men servants and maidservants, to eat and drink and get drunk, then that servant's master will come on an unexpected day and at an unknown hour, and will punish the servant severely and assign him a place with the unfaithful. That servant who knew his master's will but did not make preparations nor act in accord with his will shall be beaten severely. And the servant who is ignorant of his master's will but acted in a way deserving of a severe beating shall be beaten only lightly. Much will be required of the person entrusted with much, and still more will be demanded of the person entrusted with more." The Gospel of the Lord. So last week we were going in depth into the readings at Mass, and yesterday we just did a little simple reflection, and after Mass someone said they really missed my really long homily they taught. So we'll do a longer homily this morning. We'll teach about some of these readings from the Old Testament. So last week we read through all of the letter of Galatians, and now this week we've been going through Ephesians. And one of the themes that comes up in St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians is the idea of the Gentiles. And what is God's relation to the Gentiles, and how are the Jews supposed to relate to the Gentiles here in the New Covenant, but also how did they relate to them in the Old Covenant? I thought we'd talk about this a little bit today to shed some light on these readings from Ephesians, and also I think it can give us some guidance on some controversial issues that we experience in our culture today. What was the Jewish understanding of the Gentiles in the Old Testament? Remember when I was in seminary, one of my professors, he said that the Jews had no regard for the Gentiles whatsoever. They despised them. They had no desire to convert them. This is kind of a common understanding amongst modern scholars, and I think it is completely false. What was the Jewish regard for Gentiles? They wanted to convert them. They wanted them to believe in the one true God. And in fact, there were many Gentiles throughout the Old Testament who lived among the Israelites, amongst the Jewish people. And there are also many Gentiles who would go to the temple in the Old Testament. For example, the Acts of the Apostles mentions a few of them, and it calls them God-fearers, people who were not Jewish, but who would go to the temple nonetheless, because they believed in the God of the Israelites. This is one of the reasons, for example, in the Old Testament, why God was sometimes very unmerciful towards people who were getting in the way of the Israelites. Remember the conquest of the Promised Land. Sometimes we read that as modern readers and we think, man, that seems pretty wrathful, pretty unmerciful. The Israelites going through the different towns and killing everybody who lived there. And it's kind of a complex question, but one of the reasons why there was not a whole lot of mercy offered to those people is because put yourself in their place. Surely, with the Israelites wandering around in their neighborhood in the desert for 40 years, surely they would have heard about what the God of Israel had done to the Egyptians and how the Egyptians had refused to let the Israelites go. And so therefore they experienced plagues and death. Those people living in the Promised Land surely would have known what had happened, and they knew where the Israelites were going to end up. And instead of welcoming the Israelites into the Promised Land, instead they chose to fight against them and to fight against the God of Israel. That's part of the reason why there wasn't a whole lot of mercy offered to them. But some of the people, they did. For example, the prostitute Rahab. Remember when Joshua and the Israelites entered into Jericho, it was Rahab who helped them enter into the city, and so her life was spared. And all throughout the Old Testament, there were people who heard about the Israelites and the God of Israel, and so they wanted to become members of that people. And in some ways to worship that same God and put aside other pagan idols. This happened throughout the Scriptures. In fact, the Old Testament actually gave specific rules for those people. Those God-fearers, they were welcomed among the people of Israel, but they weren't considered members of the covenant. They weren't considered full citizens, you might say, of Israel. Not all of the Old Covenant laws applied to them. And the liturgy that was performed in the temple, they could only participate in certain degrees. Right? So think about that. Listen to the reading from St. Paul yesterday. Speaking to the Gentiles who had now become Christians, he said this: "So then you are no longer strangers and sojourners." That was another common name of the God-fearers in the Old Testament. "Rather, now you are fellow citizens of the holy ones. Now you are members of the household of God." So St. Paul was telling the Gentile Christians that even in the Old Testament, they were considered strangers or sojourners, God-fearers, but now, through baptism and through participation in the liturgy, they are considered citizens of Israel, members of the household. Now, something interesting about some of those Old Testament laws, which I think is helpful for understanding our situations today. Sometimes you'll hear ignorant people, oftentimes even priests, and sometimes, sadly, bishops, who talk about this idea of immigration and modern policy. And they have this idea that church teaching says that we just need to have no rules about immigration whatsoever. That's actually not what the Bible taught. It's not what the Bible teaches. Did you know that in the book of Deuteronomy, when it speaks about these laws of God-fearers, people who weren't Israelites but who wanted to be among the people, there were actually rules set up. In their way, it was laws of immigration. For example, one of the laws said that if you were not a member of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, but you were like a distant relative, like, for example, maybe you were an Egyptian who was friendly to the Israelites, or maybe you were a descendant of Esau, right, in the land of Edom. It was said in the book of Deuteronomy that you could enter into the covenant of Israel, but only after 3 generations. You had to wait 3 generations before you could become a member of the covenant. So if people came seeking that, likely they would never be an Israelite, but perhaps their grandchildren would be. The book of Deuteronomy also gives a rule about people who are hostile to the Israelites. For example, the Moabites or the Amalekites. What the book of Deuteronomy said is that if you are a member of those tribes, you were never permitted to become a citizen of the Israelites, a member of the covenant. Not very politically correct, is it? Changes how we think about some of these things. And if you go to Israel today, you'll experience some of the same thing. If you go to Israel and say, hey, I want to become a citizen, I want to have all the rights and privileges of citizenship in Israel, it's not going to happen, right? It's very strict. It's because they're rooted in some of these teachings of the Old Testament. So I just want us to know that so that we can have a little bit more of a sophisticated understanding when it comes to church teaching on immigration. We should be welcoming to all people. We should be friendly. We should treat all with dignity. But that doesn't mean that everybody should have the full rights of citizenship. That's not what the church teaches. Right? It's a policy that is up for debate. Now, this is also, I think, should give us some guidance when we think about, well, what do we do with non-Catholics who come to Mass and they want to become Catholic and they want to worship with us? And again, one of the most offensive things they experience is they find out that they're not admitted to Holy Communion, right? Why not? Well, because they're not members of the covenant yet, and therefore they cannot be admitted to the full liturgical participation that you and I, as members of the covenant, have full privileges to. All of these things, so much of this stuff we talk about as Catholics and modern debates and issues, it'd be so helpful if we just knew a little bit more about the Scriptures. And I think it also sheds light on, when we read these letters of St. Paul, it brings new insights to us.